the questioning some of the measures we could now take to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Godson. Dr. Rumer.
Chairman Burr, Vice Chairman Warner, distinguished members of the committee, I'm honored to be here today. Russian active measures and interference in our presidential campaign is one of the most contentious issues in our national conversation. I believe that Russian intelligence services and their proxies intervened in our election in 2016. I have not seen the classified evidence behind the intelligence community assessment published a few weeks ago. Some have criticized it for not sharing the evidence of Russian intrusions. They missed the mark. It is the totality of Russian efforts in plain sight to mislead, to misinform, to exaggerate that is more convincing than any cyber evidence. RT, Russia Today broadcasts, internet trolls, fake news, and so on are an integral part of Russian foreign policy today. We need to put this in the context of the quarter century since the end of the Cold War. World War II in Europe, or the Great Patriotic War as Russians call it, is integral to the formative experience of every living Russian. The country's national narrative is impossible without it. In 1941, Hitler's armies were stopped just outside the gates of Moscow. In 1945, Stalin's armies entered Berlin. That was Russia's greatest generation. Generations of Russians since then have been taught that their country was at its most secure then because it was protected by a buffer, the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Empire. In 1991, Russians lost that buffer, the legacy of their greatest generation. With their country falling apart, Russian leaders had no choice but to accept this loss for as long as Russia would remain weak. The 90s were a terrible decade for Russia, but a great decade for the West. For Russian leaders, and many regular Russians, the dominance of the West came at the expense of Russia's loss in the Cold War. But Russia would not remain weak indefinitely. Its economic recovery led to a return to a much more assertive posture, aggressive posture, some would say, on the world stage. We saw it in the crushing of Georgia in 2008, in the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and we see it to the present day in the ongoing war in eastern Ukraine. For the West, Russia's return to the world stage has been nothing more than pure revanchism. For Russia, it is restoring some balance in their relationship with the West. The narrative of restoring the balance, correcting the injustice and the distortions of the 1990s has been absolutely essential to Russian propaganda since the beginning of the Putin era. Those Russians who disagree are branded as foreign agents and enemies of the people. But Russia's capabilities should not be overestimated. Its GDP is about $1.3 trillion versus US GDP of over $18 trillion. Russian defense spending is estimated at about $65 billion. That's a little more than President Trump's proposed increase in US defense spending for FY 2018. The Russian military is undeniably stronger than its smaller and weaker neighbors. Yet the balance does not favor Russia when compared to NATO. A NATO-Russia war would be an act of mutual suicide, and the Kremlin is not ready for it. Russian leaders have embraced a different toolkit: information warfare, intimidation, espionage, economic tools, and so on. This toolkit is meant to make up for Russia's conventional shortcomings vis-à-vis the West. The Kremlin has a number of advantages here. The circle of deciders is limited to a handful of Putin associates with similar worldviews. They have considerable resources at their disposal, especially since most of their tools are quite cheap. A handful of cyber criminals cost a lot less than an armored brigade, but can do a lot of damage. Russian meddling in our presidential election most likely is viewed by the Kremlin as an unqualified success. The payoffs include, but are not limited to: 1, a major distraction to the United States, for the United States; damage to US leadership in the world; and perhaps most importantly, the demonstration effect. The Kremlin can do this to the world's sole remaining global superpower. Imagine how other countries see it. The differences between Russia and the United States are profound, and will not be resolved soon. This is not a crisis, not something that will pass soon. It is the new normal. We will see Russia relying on this toolkit in the months and years to come, in the upcoming elections in France and in Germany this year, in our own future political campaigns. Deception and active measures have long been and will remain a staple of Russian dealings with the outside world for the foreseeable future. Thank you.
Dr. Rumer, thank you.